And that's what, in my private practice, the executives that were coming to see me, and the reason I was able to grow that practice is because they were all trying to figure out how to relax. They had no idea. There were no tools out there.
This is the Rebel HR Podcast, the podcast where we talk to HR innovators about all things people leadership. If you're looking for places to find about new ways to think about the world of work, this is the podcast for you. Please subscribe from your favorite podcast listening platform today and leave us a review. Rebel on, HR Rebels. Welcome back, Rebel HR listeners. Extremely excited. With us today, we have Jennifer Ciarimboli. She is the founder of Studio B, as well as CEO. She began her career in the telecommunications industry. After a decade of success, she suffered from burnout and transformed her life. So really excited to talk about Jennifer and her journey, as well as how we can think about some of her work as it relates to human resources and the workforce. Welcome to the show, Jennifer.
Hi. Hi, Kyle. It's so nice to be here with you. How are you?
Doing really well. Really excited to finally have the chance to talk with you. We've had to reschedule this a couple times, but I really appreciate your flexibility and spending some time. I think this topic is going to be really powerful for our listeners. So I want to start off just by understanding a little bit more about your background and what prompted you to found Studio B.
I get asked that question often, and I apologize. I've been in meetings like 6, Zoom meetings back to back before our call today. So I might feel a little frazzled for a second.
No judgment. We've got plenty of grace here. Every single one of these listeners can relate to what you just said.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, I'm sure they can. And it's too much, by the way. So, and I know better, but I digress. So, I started thinking about this work after really having some personal experiences. You mentioned that I experienced burnout, and at the time, like the word burnout was in our vocabulary. This is back in 2005, 2007. In that period of time, like I knew what I was experiencing was burnout, but we didn't really have a definition for it. At least not a clinical definition, right? That didn't come out until many, many years later. And so, but what I experienced personally is, I was in a job that I once really enjoyed. I was working in the telecom industry. I had worked my way up from general business sales, like slinging long distance services, to selling wide area network infrastructure, hardware and software to, national and international companies, and landed in the national account space. So I had kind of, reached, I had reached all my goals in that job, and I had learned a lot. I learned how to manage and be with, manage my own team and articulate, our needs throughout the organization, kind of navigating that corporate infrastructure. I really understood, how to navigate my way around client accounts and communicate and engage with decision makers and move contracts through, the funnel, and then also, go through the implementation process and so on and so forth. So, I was in a space where I was still young, still learning, still really engaged. And yet, I was burning the candle at both ends. I had 3 kids at the time. I have 4 in total now. But at the time my kids were young, we were a young family. I was traveling all the time. I just didn't have the boundaries. I didn't know how to set those good, healthy boundaries and really manage my personal life and my work life in a way that was healthy, right? And that you could only do that for so long, right? So of course, I hit a wall. My relationship, my marriage specifically, was kind of falling apart. I was worried about my kids. I was, jumping on funnel calls every day with my teams. And, I was just sick. I lost probably 25 pounds. I wasn't taking care of myself. My mental health, I was starting to have anxiety, overwhelm, my relationships are falling apart, the whole thing. Right. So, I mean, that experience, and you get to a point where you just can't do it anymore. Right. So, and the first thing to go is your engagement, or for me, at least, I can only speak from my personal experience. The first thing to really crash and burn was my work. I just ended up hating my job, hating the people I worked with. It certainly wasn't their fault, but I was showing up differently. And I just couldn't, I just had no, I had no sense of, knowing how to support myself. I had no tools to inner resource. And I just let it all fall down. And I think that's what happens to people. Like, they turn around and they're like, what just happened? So I left my job. I really needed to. I needed to get some support. I needed to work through, a divorce, work through kind of figuring out what direction my life was going to go in. So I don't think it typically that gets that terrible for people. I hope. I mean, I do know that I know a lot of people that have similar stories, but for me, it got pretty bad. And I did leave the job, and I did kind of crawl out of that hole. But it took a couple of years, and it took a lot of intervention. It took leaning into a lot of resources externally, so that I could build those internal resources and kind of, get healthy. And I did that. And I didn't go back. I didn't go back into business marketing, where I was educated. I actually became a yoga teacher. I started that process in 2007 with my first 200-hour teacher training program. And I did that not only because at the time, I don't think my intention was to teach full time. I think my intention was to support inner growth. And I had been doing yoga for about 10 years at the time. And I think it was probably the only thing that kept me off of medication when I hit that really bad space. And I'm not advocating for not medicating, just so everybody's clear. I'm absolutely an advocate for all of the resources that you need to stay and get healthy. But for me, I'm a pretty physical person. I like to run, hike, I love to, I was a dancer as a kid. And so yoga for me was something that I could be in my body. I could just be in the breath. I could just land on my mat and maintain. And at the time, I just felt that I was being called to just deepen my experience. And that was the only intention. And that led me down a road of really, I'm one of those kind of people that when I'm in, I'm all in, right? So I wanted to know everything. I get really nerdy with the science and the history and the philosophy and the details. And, I love to learn. I think I'm a lifelong learner. I hope that never changes. So I really did. I ended up having over 2,000 hours of training in yoga and mindfulness. I went through a two-year training in mindfulness practices specifically. I've studied Buddhism extensively. I did a year in London studying with my primary teachers there. I owned a yoga studio for 6.5 years. I taught yoga and mindfulness practices full time for 12 years. And, I got to a point where I was really, really healthy and steady and well and I still am. That's the good news. But but at that point, like when I got through like that crisis period and like stabilized and really started supporting other people and seeing, especially, with my private practice, I worked mainly with executives because they related, to me. They related to the experiences that I was coming into the practice with, being in the corporate world, struggling with burnout, overwhelm, anxiety, stress. And so I worked primarily with men, many executives, lawyers, doctors, also women too. But I was just getting all these like men who, were in these really powerful positions, and then they'd go and, run a triathlon or participate in triathlon or run a half marathon on the weekends. And, that's such a classic type A response. Like, I'm stressed out, so I'm going to go stress my body out
Yeah.
more. And, and it's so funny.
I'm laughing.
Yeah.
I'm laughing because I just did a half Ironman last year. So yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, what they were coming to see me, because it really, my yoga practice, and when I started my yoga practice and I was, in the workplace, in corporate sales, I did Ashtanga yoga, which is a really intense, disciplined, muscle, strength-based yang practice. But when I went through that whole period and I was really figuring out how to heal my nervous system, because that's really what it was about, is how do I stabilize and heal my nervous system in this body? That's when I really leaned into restorative practices, yin yoga, and mindfulness and pranayama practices, breathing practices. And that's what, in my private practice, the executives that were coming to see me, and the reason I was able to grow that practice is because they were all trying to figure out how to relax, right? They had no idea. There were no tools out there, right? And, it's funny because doctors or PAs, nurses, whatever, they often will recommend yoga as a way to, cope with stress and help people with anxiety and overwhelm, depression, whatever. And it's always a wonderful thing, but they should be really specific and, hey, seek out somebody that can teach you restorative practices in perhaps the yoga modality, right? Somatic practices. Find a teacher who is skilled to teach you method and technique to calm your system, right? Because there's tons of, and this is a big problem in the yoga world, is that these 200-hour programs, they're just not well monitored. You kind of don't know what you're going to get, so people don't know that when they go out to, drop into a yoga class, hey, they may be dropping into a class that's super intense, that's going to max out your nervous system with loud music and hot, heat and all. And all of those fun, right? Those things are fun. I mean, I'm not saying that I don't enjoy them, but if you're already kind of burning the candle at both ends, have this yang disposition, this type A personality, really what you don't need is more physical yang practices, right? You need to learn how to be in the body in stillness, with care and compassion, right? And be an inner friend to yourself. And the reason why I'm bringing all this in is because as I went further and further down my career in the well-being realm, running and owning a studio and teaching full time and working with these people and kind of noticing who was showing up, I kind of naturally started thinking about, okay, I had this experience. I understand where these people are coming from, and I know how to help them. So how do I bring this together? And then, I mentioned I was doing study in London in 2017, 2018. And I was with a group of 25 women from around the world who were also studying Buddhism and mindfulness practices, specifically from, Theravadan kind of teachings, Vipassana teachings, so on and so forth. And these women were expert teachers. They were lifelong practitioners. They had, a consistent, dedicated practice for decades. And I would say 80% of the women in that circle of women had also experienced the exact same thing that I experienced. They were in corporate, in the corporate world. Some of them were lawyers or physicians or professors or, but they had a career prior to this where they burned out, they left their career. It was too much, and then they committed their lives to these practices and being a teacher, being a healer in the world. And what I found most fascinating is that they were also the teachers that were really struggling to kind of build a sustainable income as a teacher, right? They didn't really have business skills to kind of promote themselves and so on and so forth. And that's really when, during that period of time, when the entire business plan, like the original business plan of Studio B, kind of fell in my lap. I was like, oh, wait a second. There's a dramatic need to bring highly skilled expert resources. And in this, specific case, I'm talking about mindfulness and yoga teachers. And we've expanded there, obviously. But expert resources to people as interventions in the workplace because people need it. And remember, this is pre-pandemic, so 2017. So the problem has been around for a long time. The pandemic just blew it up, right? I mean, it just escalated. It brought the light of awareness to like, hey, pay attention here because people are crashing. We are in a crisis, a massive global crisis right now. And if you peel up the layers here, a lot of these problems have been here for a long time. Of course, not the pandemic, not the virus, but mental health has been a crisis, not only in the United States, but throughout the world for decades, right? And nobody's been attending to it. So it's been very, very interesting. We launched Studio B. I launched Studio B in January of 2019. And I would say the main focus that I've had that's been consistent, right? Since 2017, when I started thinking about, the company to launch to now, and obviously it's been 4 years. There's been a lot of growth and development and, just expansion and all of that, learning with our customers and so on and so forth. But the one continuum throughout from then till now is I'm most concerned about accessibility for people because, remember, I owned the studio for a significant amount of years. Guess who's coming in the door? Privileged white people, right? And not many people in the world can afford or has access to expert teachers or resources on their own dime, right? It's just true, right? And for the people that can afford it, many of them don't feel comfortable walking into studios, especially, we're not in a major city here in Northeast Pennsylvania. We're, in between cities. We're 2 hours from New York City. We're 2 hours from Philadelphia. So our population or demographic is different. So, a single mom or a Hispanic man or a Black woman might not feel comfortable going to the local yoga studio where the majority of the people there are going to be white upper class women, right? They just aren't going to feel comfortable. Yet they're interested and curious about the practices, but how do we provide accessibility to everybody so that there's no barriers to accessing resources that can be very helpful? And now we have 20 years of science proving that and I'm just going to use mindfulness as an example. There's over 12,000 studies now on the efficacy of mindfulness practices for our health and well-being, not just our mental health, right? Our physical health, our relational health, the health of a society even. So it ripples out. And we need to make sure that people have access. So that's always been the mission. How do we bring these practices? How do we bring these resources and people, these experts, forward in a way that people can learn how to take better care of themselves and each other?
Absolutely. I think, really just so much, powerful content and things to consider, especially from, an HR standpoint where, sometimes, not necessarily always, but sometimes the cause of some of this challenge for people is the workplace, right? And, that or it can certainly at least be a catalyst. So, yeah, we were talking before I hit record about a term that is new for me. And so I'd like to explore this a little bit. And that the term that you used was regenerative workplace. So as you think about that, kind of the context of what you just shared and regenerative workplaces, what does that mean? What does that look like, in your mind? And how can we facilitate that as HR professionals?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And, I've seen definitions kind of floating in and out. There's, white papers that are naming this aspiration. I think the Surgeon General just released supportive material for well-being in workplaces and flourishing in workplaces, human flourishing. So, without the structure of a culture and leadership's commitment to that culture to transform, pretty progressively transform into a culture where everyone is cared for and resourced appropriately to thrive. What does that mean to, the question is, we could turn that all around and say, the question is how, right? What does it mean to me? And I think that the answer or the definition to regenerative workplace is very specific to each organization that is thinking in those terms. Because of course, every organization it is thinking about it differently based on their organizational readiness for something like this, right? So if the organization has never thought ever about well-being or wellness even, right, as an imperative to their company culture, as a benefit that is absolutely needed, just as a baseline, then are they going to be considering what a regenerative workplace means for them? The answer is no. So I think it depends. And I think it's a question that needs to be asked to every leader involved in any organization in 2022, going into 2023, coming out of the pandemic, trying to figure out how to deploy resources across the organization that are going to be transformative. So I think there's more questions than answers or definitions in what that means, because it's so specific to the culture that you're in.
We'll be back after a quick break.
And so used to having everything in front of them right away that we forget that innovation just takes time. I myself, I get frustrated too. Why? And this as being one of my best friends is, hey, I talk to you all the time. Hey, man, I'm frustrated in the fact that I can't seem to just get there in
Mm-hmm.
the next day. But that's just not how these things work, right? Innovation needs to be planned out. It needs to be very methodical. And then when it finally hits, that's when it seems like to everyone else that it sort of just came out of nowhere. But to you, you know the amount of dedication that it took over that time.
Absolutely. I think it's just a really, it's really an interesting aspect of a human resources professional's job at this point. And like you said, I just think about my experience of, this was not on our radar 15 years ago. This
Oh,
really
no.
has been thrust into the spotlight, but but it's been there, right?
Yes.
It's continually been there, and we've dealt with these challenges, but typically they've taken the symptom of somebody who's acting out at work, or conflict at work with coworkers, or people who are taking leave of absences for undisclosed reasons. But we haven't had the vocabulary or the focus on it now. So I think we're at a really important and potentially transformative spot for companies to take some ownership of this and really support their employees, and as well as themselves.
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to say. I mean, every HR executive, and by the way, it's not fair that any of this is being pushed into the lap of HR executives, to be honest, right? I mean, it's just outrageous. And what we're seeing, especially in the enterprise space, is that, executive boards, the board of directors, the leadership of the company is really also in agreement, right? So they're now pulling some of this, some companies, not all, of course, but some companies really high up on that organizational readiness realm. They get it. They're deploying resources. They're looking at interventions. But what they're most importantly doing is they are hiring chief well-being officers or chief medical officers, chief DEI officers, and they're assembling a team of people that bring clinical experience into mental health support specifically, right? They're also looking at other domains of well-being, of course, but we're working with a company that recently, within the last 2 years, hired a chief medical officer, from a major research institution. So we're seeing these investments being made by executive teams to really say, no, well-being is an imperative, and they need to have their own budget, right? And resources and teams so that we can shift the culture of our company dramatically into a culture of care. And of course, it takes time because, some of these resources came on board during the pandemic, out of necessity, right? Out of pure terror, basically. And now, we've gotten, arguably to the other side of this thing, post-pandemic. I don't know. My husband just had COVID 2 weeks ago. So.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know when we're post-pandemic, but I'm going to go with close enough. I don't know.
I don't know. So I hate even talking about it, but we've learned a lot. We've built a lot of tools, have been designed and built. And I think a lot of processes have been built with, internally within our clients' within companies, so that they're, trying to figure out, how do I operationalize this, right? Because well-being, we're talking about well-being, right? So how do you operationalize well-being? These are the questions that are being asked. And these are the questions we're asking ourselves, is because, quite frankly, these decision makers are leaning into, people like me and my team, and our partners to kind of give them some advice here. And so, their systems are being developed and assessments are being developed, and these tools, I think, we're going to see dramatic transformation in tools like ours over the next, 3 to 5 years, over the next 5 to 10 years. So we're learning so much, and I think, those are the conversations that are happening. But what I'm always reminding myself is everything we're talking about right now is going to be different 6 months from now, a year from now, 24, because we are learning so much every day. We have more research, more peer-reviewed research, more data coming out every day. There's people all over the world working on solutions for flourishing in the workplace. And it's an exciting time to be doing this work.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, from my standpoint, I do appreciate the you giving us HR people an out, because we are not, chief medical officers or psychologists. Some of us are, industrial and organizational psych majors, which is the closest but that doesn't mean that we understand, medical needs for people, right? It just means we have, an understanding of some of the psychological principles as it relates to the workplace. But I do think, leveraging that expertise, being that sense of conscious or conscience for your organization is so important. And even asking those tough questions, like, how are we helping our employees through this, to your leadership team? I think that that's the role that we play, as well as yeah. And when people are struggling too, right? We're here to help.
Oh my God.
Ideally.
Oh my God. Struggling so much. I mean, I want to say one thing though. I don't want any HR executive that might be listening to this to think that they're not capable or not, qualified, or none of that is true. I mean, HR is dramatically important in the process, right? But what I'm saying is that we can bring in additional resources that and companies are, and I think it's great, because HR has had enough, right? They've had enough on their plate, especially over the last 3 years. So they need support, and it doesn't eliminate them from the process of rolling this out, of understanding how it relates to the other benefits that have been deployed, of really understanding what people need. And I think that's where we see HR playing such a critical role. Like, there's been a lot of tools that have been just deployed because people don't know what the heck to do. So they're like, okay, I'm going to subscribe to this app or this service, or, bring in a yoga teacher, for a yoga class on site or virtually, once a week. I think I forget who said it, but there was a famous quote recently, and it was like, you can't yoga your way out of this, right? That's true. I mean, yoga is one of the things we bring forward as a tool, but it's certainly not all we do. And so I think people get confused a little when they start looking at Studio B as a solution, because they think, oh, well, it's just yoga and mindfulness. Well, not really, right? Those are just some of the tools that we lean into. We believe that the foundation of all well-being in any domain is a development of awareness, right? So how do we develop awareness so that we understand how we're feeling when we're feeling it, or how we're reacting or responding when it's actually happening? How are we, how is our individual ability to ground in present moment awareness so that our attention is fully in this space right now, right? And I do wholeheartedly believe, and maybe obviously it could be from my 25 years of practicing yoga and mindfulness, but I wholeheartedly believe that without tools to develop awareness, to be present and in the moment wholeheartedly with compassion and curiosity and kindness to ourselves and others, that, we're not sustainable without it. So yeah, we lean a lot into the development of awareness through mindfulness practices, through compassion practices, metta, kindness, gratitude, generosity, all of these qualities, these natural human capacities that we all have, right? So how do we harness these capacities and develop tools so that we could not only feel better, but then apply those tools to relational challenges that come up every single day, right? Whether it's with the people we work with or our kids or our family or, whatever. So, yeah. I feel like I'm rambling.
And I'm just listening and soaking it all in, Jennifer. So, I haven't asked many questions, but I just feel like it's such an important topic, and I want to make sure you have an opportunity to give us as much content as possible. I do think, this is something on a personal level that I've certainly been on a personal journey of mindfulness and meditation, and, I'm trying to relax, but still struggle to stay present and focused with everything that's going on. I maybe I have one more question that I think is maybe important to align our listeners around, and that's the topic of metta. And I think it's one of those things that, in the Western society might be maybe sound a little woo-woo, but I think it's such a powerful topic. So can you just kind of walk our listeners through it? What do you mean by metta? What is this approach to the world, and how can we reflect that, in our day-to-day lives?
Yeah. Yes, you're right. And I should have defined that when I said it. So I'm glad you asked the question. Metta really translates as loving kindness. And really what it translates to are the capacities of the heart, right? So if we think about loving kindness as a natural human capacity first and foremost, philosophically, that means that, we come into this body, into this life with this pure heart, with this open, pure heart. And we could trust it. We could trust the capacity of the heart to be boundless, right? And we could keep adding to that capacity, and we could keep kind of flexing it through practices that remind us of how powerful that heart connection is, right? So that's really what the metta practices do. They're a reminder that we have this, we could trust this capacity to love and be kind to ourselves and each other. And of course, all these other beautiful human qualities are related to metta. And I mentioned some of them, specifically compassion and empathy. We talk a lot about compassion practices and self-compassion practices and the development of empathy and how important that is when we're in a leadership role, that we could lead people with empathy. So metta practices are essentially, and there's a lot of ways to do them. There's very traditional practices that you can go through, traditional, essentially, traditional sayings or kind of similar to mantra, but a little different, where you go through a metta practice and you're led to extend loving kindness, like energetically, and kind of imagining, leaning into this kind of unknown space, right? Of imagining someone that's really easy to extend love to. That could be your pet or a child in your life or a grandparent, as an example. And if you could kind of imagine this person or being and extend loving kindness with some simple phrases like, may you be well, may you be healthy, may you be safe, may you be filled with loving kindness. So those are just some simple phrases that we could use, and we could kind of imagine this being enveloped in this beautiful wish or aspiration for them. And when you go through the practice of loving kindness, you actually feel warmth in your heart, and you feel more connected to the person that you're imagining. And you kind of go through this exercise where, you then imagine extending loving kindness to someone, neutral, that you might not know well, but you see often, that you don't have any strong feelings for. Maybe, I always think of this guy that works at the UPS office that I drop packages off at, because he's just got this big personality and he always makes me smile. And I think about, sending him metta and how, he's just always kind, right? So somebody like that you don't really have any charged, relationships with. And then you go down like this road of, okay, can I send metta now to somebody that's difficult to love, right? Maybe that person at work that you are challenged with currently, or, a family member or spouse or friend. And we build this capacity over time to be with discomfort in a way that really transforms our relationship with discomfort, right? Because I'm getting into a lot now. You can tell I'm a teacher, but but the metta practices,
I'm just, yeah, it's great.
They have a physical experience when they're done the right way, in a quiet space with the support of a teacher. And it does build this inner trust that I could sit with something, or I could turn towards something that's really uncomfortable, and I could just land in my body in a different way, and not shut down, not become reactive immediately, not turn away from the discomfort that I'm experiencing, but rather stay open. So, these practices are very powerful and very transformative, and you have to kind of get introduced to them, in the right way, slowly, with the guidance of a teacher, because as you said, the practices are simple, but simple doesn't mean easy, right?
Right.
Even mindfulness practices, metta practices, breathing practices, embodied movement practices, we could get into trauma. We'd have to have a whole other conversation about trauma and working with.
Yeah.
But, these practices are really potent, very powerful, very transformative, and people need the support of a teacher. Or sometimes it's just too hard.
Yeah. But I think, there's so much there. I think, if I could maybe leave our audience with something to consider is, if you're not thinking about these sorts of things as it relates to the workforce, there's a huge opportunity here to really step up and help people, and maybe ask those questions of both your organization and of yourself. Because if you're not coming to work, with full mindfulness and presence and and an open heart and mind, you may not be, doing your employees the service that they need you to do in your role as a human resources professional. So with that being said, we're going to shift gears. We're going to go through the Rebel HR flash round really quick here, because we're quickly running out of time. So question number 1, where does HR need to rebel?
Toxic work culture. Absolutely. We need to be in a culture where it's okay to take a break, where it's okay to rest, where it's okay to be honest, where it's okay to check out and set clear and healthy boundaries.
Absolutely. And, every time I get ready to send an email on a Saturday, I have to remind myself of that. So that's a good call out. Thank you for that. All right. Question number 2, who should we be listening to?
Artists. let's listen more to the artists, to the creatives, to the songwriters, to the poets. Stay inspired in your life, and that will translate to inspiration in your work.
I love it. I love it. All right. Last question here. How can our listeners connect with you, learn more about some of your work and some of the important topics we discussed today?
Oh, absolutely. Well, you could always email me, and I'm sure you'll share that information, but it's jennifer@meetyourcenter.com. You could go to our website. It's studiobmindfulness.com. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm not super active. Unfortunately, I'm not a super active social media person, but I am on there. I'm on LinkedIn. I don't know what my handle is. I'm gonna hope that you'll share that as well. And I'm also on Instagram, and I do share there more with some good tips. Studio B Mindfulness is on Instagram, and my handle on Instagram is Jenny in Zen. So I'd love to get some follows, and I would, definitely welcome any opportunity to connect.
Absolutely. Really, really appreciate it. And just an absolutely wonderful, wonderful discussion. Really important and critical topic. And I've gained so much value from this conversation that I'm sure our listeners have as well. Thank you for the time, Jennifer.
Awesome. Thank you so much for inviting me. Have a good afternoon.
You too. Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.
All right, that does it for the Rebel HR podcast. Big thank you to our guests. Follow us on Facebook at Rebel HR Podcast, Twitter at Rebel HR Guy, or see our website at rebelhumanresources.com. The views and opinions expressed by Rebel HR Podcast are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any of the organizations that we represent. No animals were harmed during the filming of this podcast.
Baby.